What if one of World War II's most terrifying weapons stood only 16 inches tall? Imagine a box no bigger than a child's suitcase, but packed with enough explosives to bring down a house. This was the Goliath, a remote-controlled demolition vehicle built by Nazi Germany. Tiny, expendable, and designed to crawl under tanks, bunkers, and men. As Nazi forces advanced through France, something strange happened. When retreating French troops tossed a strange remote car into the Seine, no one expected it to spark an arms race. But the Germans saw a secret they could weaponize. The Germans, always eager to seize anything that could give them an edge, quickly fished it out. The device they found was a remote-controlled vehicle designed to carry explosives. It was primitive, rough around the edges, and certainly not a weapon to strike terror at first glance. But what the Germans saw wasn't just a failed idea. It was the key to winning the war. A small, remotely controlled machine, capable of delivering devastating payloads without risking human life. Soon, they reached out to Carl F.W. Borgward, a private automotive company, to develop their own version. But they didn't just want a cheap knockoff. With the war slipping away and commanders demanding answers, Borgward had weeks, not months, to turn curiosity into a weapon. The problem was clear. The Allies were closing in. The Nazis needed something that could hold the line, a weapon that could turn the tide. Their traditional methods, like tanks and artillery, were losing their edge against the Allied forces' new technologies. Borgward's first attempt, the SD KFZ 302, was powered by an electric motor, but came with issues. Limited range, high costs, and a design that was far from efficient. Imagine having a weapon that could travel less than a mile and cost as much as 3,000 Reichsmarks. That wasn't going to cut it in a war where time was running out. Despite the glaring failures, the Nazis didn't give up. They pushed Borgward to improve, to evolve. And evolve they did. When the Goliath was introduced, the Nazis faced a significant problem. Advanced defensive strategies from the Allies were rapidly neutralizing traditional German weapons. The static defenses and heavy bunkers lining the beaches of Normandy were particularly tough. And existing weapons like tanks were proving too slow or inefficient against entrenched positions. The German military needed something that could breach these defenses without risking valuable soldiers. Enter the Goliath. Months later, Borgward introduced the SD KFZ 303A, now powered by a gasoline engine. The electric model used a Bosch 2.5 kilowatt motor, but this setup had major drawbacks. The limited battery life of the early Goliath models meant they could travel only around half a mile, which was insufficient for battlefield conditions. However, the gasoline-powered model saw major improvements. Engineers boasted the petrol Goliath could run for miles. In the mud and craters of real battlefields, that promise would be tested, and often broken. But more importantly, it could carry up to 220 pounds of explosives, making it a serious threat to anything in its path. The Goliath was remote-controlled, with operators using a joystick-style control box connected by a 2,130-foot cable. The cable not only controlled movement, but also supplied power to the vehicle. The Goliath's control system used 2 strands of the cable for acceleration and steering, and a third strand was used to detonate the explosives once the target was reached. By now, these remote-controlled vehicles were given a more terrifying name by the Germans: Goliath. It wasn't just an off-the-shelf tank destroyer. It was a calculated, unmanned monster that would go straight for enemy targets, no matter the cost. But despite the improvements, there was still one thing they couldn't fix: its vulnerability. The Goliath was a brilliant weapon, but it had serious flaws. The most glaring one? It was slow, barely reaching 6 miles per hour. It couldn't cross uneven terrain, and it was fragile. The Germans had spent years developing this vehicle, but it still had one major problem. It was easily disabled. Imagine being the enemy soldier who saw one of these things coming. It would be terrifying, yes, but there was a way to stop it. It promised remote terror, until an enemy soldier with a pocket knife ended the threat in a single gesture. A machine meant to replace men was defeated by the most human of tools. That's right, one slice with a pair of scissors could take down the entire operation. While the Goliath may have seemed like a great idea on paper, it was deeply flawed in its execution. From the start, its fragility and vulnerability to mechanical failures set it up for failure. The design choices, such as the thin material and low ground clearance, made it prone to damage, and its limited mobility meant it was easily disabled by enemy forces. It was, in essence, a one-use weapon, relying on high-risk missions without a backup plan if anything went wrong. And yet, despite all of these weaknesses, the Nazis deployed the Goliaths in various operations across Europe. From the beaches of Normandy to the heart of the Soviet front, they were there. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. As Allied forces grew stronger, the Goliath faced a new threat: improved countermeasures and a better understanding of its vulnerabilities. On D-Day, amid gunfire and rubble, the Goliath finally faced its crucible. Would it blast a bunker or become another wreck buried in the sand? The reality was grim. Most of them were rendered useless by artillery blasts that severed their control cables before they could even get close to their targets. Despite the hype, the Goliath's impact was far less than expected. One of the few recorded successes occurred in the Maritime Alps, when a Goliath successfully destroyed a vehicle of the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion. But even that victory was short-lived. The simple act of cutting the cables meant that the Goliath couldn't be controlled. Its death sentence was sealed. As the Allies advanced, the Goliath became less and less effective. Its unreliable performance, slow speed, and fragile construction couldn't withstand the harsh realities of the battlefield. The Goliath was quickly abandoned in favor of newer, more reliable technologies. Even when it was deployed, its chances of success were slim. Artillery and airstrikes destroyed many before they could even reach their targets. The sheer number of failures made it clear. The Goliath was not the game-changer the Germans had hoped for. By the end of the war, the Goliath had essentially faded into obscurity, remembered more as a tragic mistake than a weapon of war. Despite all of this, it's worth noting that the Goliath wasn't totally useless, at least not in every scenario. Some were used by the United States Army as tugs to move aircraft, but the results were the same. They broke down, because the materials were too fragile for continuous use. The Goliath, intended to be a game-changer, was too expensive and unreliable to have any lasting impact. The reality of the Goliath was not only one of failure on the battlefield, but also one of desperation. These vehicles were considered disposable, built to carry out one mission and then be destroyed, along with the enemy. For the soldiers who operated them, there was no glory. They were mere tools, designed to do the dirty work of war without any chance of survival. The men who controlled these machines were usually in the rear lines, operating them from a distance, but they had a fatal role. The moment the Goliath was sent forward, the operator knew that if it worked, there would be no coming back. The men controlling the Goliath were fighting a war where their own survival wasn't guaranteed. They were merely part of an endless cycle of destruction. And as Germany's army grew weaker, fresh recruits with little training were tasked with these death machines. They were sent to die along with their creations, thrown into hopeless battles with outdated and ineffective technology. For the soldiers tasked with controlling the Goliaths, the psychological cost was just as brutal as the physical one. They were often placed in a hopeless situation where survival was never a guarantee. These soldiers were made to operate a disposable weapon, knowing full well that once the Goliath was sent into action, there was no coming back. These men were victims of a futile mission, designed to be just another cog in a larger machine of war that offered them no chance of heroism or survival. The sense of inevitability, of being part of a weapon that was destined to fail, was a burden these men had to carry, often at the cost of their mental well-being. The Goliath symbolized the end of a once proud war machine, crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. Despite Goliath's many failures, there was one thing that could not be denied: its legacy. The Goliath may have been a disaster in terms of military utility, but it helped pave the way for modern remote-controlled vehicles. The concept of controlling a machine from a distance without risking human life was revolutionary. It failed on the battlefield, but its core idea, remote, expendable, unmanned strike, would return decades later as drones and robots. The Goliath's ghost still shapes warfare. So while the Goliath may have been a misstep in World War II, it was a crucial stepping stone toward the future of warfare. Despite Goliath's many failures, there was one thing that could not be denied: its legacy. The Goliath may have been a disaster in terms of military utility, but it helped pave the way for modern remote-controlled vehicles. The concept of controlling a machine from a distance without risking human life was revolutionary. It failed on the battlefield, but its core idea, remote, expendable, unmanned strike, would return decades later as drones and robots. The Goliath's ghost still shapes warfare. So while the Goliath may have been a misstep in World War II, it was a crucial stepping stone toward the future of warfare. Even with its complete failure, the Goliath was technologically ahead of its time. Its remote control system, designed for a small vehicle to carry out a suicide mission, became a precursor for weapon systems used decades later. But despite the advances in technology, the Goliath remained a symbol of desperation. The Goliath promised to change the battlefield. Instead, it became a warning that technology alone can't win a war.